Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture for Module 7. A couple of quick announcements before we start our lecture. First of all, this is not going to be on your exam for next week. This will be on your second exam. Your exam for next week will go through The Grapes of Wrath, which you watched hopefully last week. And this week we're going to talk about water in California, particularly how water came to San Francisco and LA. And we're going to talk a little bit about the progressive era. I'm just going to touch upon it. We're going to come back to the progressive era in a couple of modules. Next week, you're going to have your first exam. That's primarily what you're going to do next week. There will be a review sheet available at the beginning of the module, and you will have to take that exam all in one sitting. But for right now, water in the progressive era. So first of all, what is the progressive era? And again, we're going to spend more time talking about this later. I just want to touch upon it because it's relevant to water in California. It happened from the 1890s to about the 1920s / World War II, depending on who you're talking to. And basically, it was this movement in the United States to solve the problems created by industrialization and urbanization. Lots of people living in cities, lots of pollution, lots of bad living conditions, lots of poverty. And so the progressives were people who wanted to fix these problems. And this is part of the good governance movement. And what I mean by the good governance movement is that this is the idea that the government should be working for the people, for the common man, not just for big money and people with a lot of money. We'll talk later on about whether or not we're in a new progressive era in the United States, in such that there are a lot of people who are pushing for this too, that money should not have such an influence on the government. But this is when we see the rise of monopolies, and including things for like steel and the railroad and oil, and some people who are extraordinarily wealthy and people who are extraordinarily poor. And so the progressive era is kind of a pushback against that. Lots of movements to protect social welfare. This did not take place in California, but this is Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which kind of brought to light workers' rights in Chicago, some of the poor conditions and the very unsafe conditions that people were working in. Also, things at this time highlighted kind of living conditions, especially in poor housing, tenement housing. And we also see the rise of unions. So this idea that people can get together and organize and fight for better rights at their job. They can strike, they can do some other things. And up until this point, very often that was illegal, right? You could not strike. And also concerns with morality. So during this time, we also get prohibition, which is when we briefly outlawed alcohol in the United States. And so lots of emphasis on personal behavior as well. So we see here this poster, we have a brewer, and this is to vote on prohibition, as opposed to the mother with the small children. So lots of things about personal behavior. So we are fighting back against money, but it's also that we want people to make like good personal choices, and that it's their responsibility to do so. I believe I talked about this a little bit in the past, but at this time we have this push and pull also between the preservation ethic and the conservation ethic. So here's John Muir, who's the father of Yosemite National Park. And he believed nature deserves to be protected for its own inherent value and that we should protect our environment in a pristine and unaltered state. This is not the progressives. This is also going on at this time, but this is not the progressives. The progressives are people like Gifford Pinchot here, who was in charge of the Forest Service in the United States, and that is to use natural resources wisely. They utilize a utilitarian standard that calls for using resources for the greatest good, for the most people, for the longest time. This is really important when we're talking about water in California, because this is how cities kind of justified either removing water from places of low population to places of large population, because that's the most people, or kind of destroying, in the case of Hetch Hetchy, this kind of beautiful natural landscape in order to create this reservoir. So first I'm going to talk about San Francisco, and then I'm going to talk about LA. But in the growing city of San Francisco during this time needed a stable water supply. They had dealt with the earthquake and subsequent fire. And so many people blamed that fire spreading so much on the fact that they did not have a consistent water supply. And at this time, water is a private entity, not a public utility, which it still is in some parts of the world, right? You have to just pay a private entity for your water. Water in the United States right now is a public entity. We still pay for it, but it's a lot less expensive, and we have a reliable, for the most part, water supply. You go to your house, flip on the faucet, water's coming out. And in San Francisco, the local water was problematic. Most of it's salty, so not good for drinking or a bunch of other things. And also, it's an arid environment, meaning it doesn't rain very often. So, retaining that rainwater, there's just not enough of it. And so, what San Francisco did was they looked to Yosemite National Park, to the Tuolumne River, to the Hetch Hetchy Valley, and they built a dam and flooded the valley. I'll show a picture of that in a second. And basically created the Hetch Hetchy Aqueduct, which created this gravity-fed system that flowed all the way from the Hetch Hetchy all the way down to San Francisco, and still does today. So you can see here is what the Hetch Hetchy Valley looked like before the flooding on the left, and then after the flooding on the right. So you're going to watch a short video about this as well. Basically it was another Yosemite Valley. And you can imagine that if you visited Yosemite Valley, it's truly a magnificent kind of landscape. People are still suing about this to get rid of this reservoir and restore this valley, because it is technically in a national park, and they argue that it goes against the mandate of national parks in order to have this reservoir in there. And but it solved the problem. It gave a bunch of water to San Francisco. People argue that they really don't need that water anymore. They have water from other sources, and that they could get rid of it if they just make the system more efficient. And you'll hear some of those arguments in that video that you are going to watch. LA is a little different. It's actually a lot different. So unlike San Francisco, who went and kind of made a deal with the federal government in order to have this inside of a national park, which John Muir was very, very opposed to. He did not like it. He died shortly before the reservoir was completed. LA did not do that. They did things a lot more covertly. So, and the architect of this was William Mulholland. If you have spent any time in... So William Mulholland was born in Ireland, and he came to California in 1877. He was in some other places first, but he basically went from a conservationist to an empire builder. So he was very into this idea of conserving nature, but he is really responsible for the growth of LA, and for the ability of LA to go from this relatively small city to an incredibly large and important one. He was definitely believing in that greatest good for the greatest number of people. And you're going to see how he took water from the Owens Valley in order to do that. He's very interesting. He never graduated grade school, but he was in charge of and engineered kind of this incredible water delivery system that really revolutionized Los Angeles. So in Los Angeles in 1880, we only have about 11,000 people. Right, it's very small. It's not quite an important city on the map. And then the railroad is built. The railroad comes to LA, and by 1900, there are 100,000 people. So there's 100,000 people in LA. And the LA River, which is the primary source of water, is being tapped dry. Much like San Francisco now, we don't kind of have enough water. We don't have a reliable water source. Water is very, very scarce. And LA at the same time is really desperate to become a modern city. They want to, become San Francisco or New York. They want to be an important city on the map. And so, here is a picture of what is now part of the LA River, right? The LA water system does not look like a natural water system by any means anymore. Um, it has LA dramatically changed the natural landscape. And one of the ways that they did that was they went to find water um, in Owens Valley via the Owens River. So Owens Valley had a very large and old agricultural and ranching community. They had very, very old water rights. Those people who were farming in that area and ranching in that area had water rights to the Owens River for an incredibly long time. And you also had the Paiute Native Americans who were also living there utilizing the river. And off of Owens River is Owens Lake. And so Owens Lake was an endorheic lake. And you would learn a lot about this in my physical geography class. But an endorheic lake is basically a lake that has no outlet to a river that eventually goes into the ocean. So all freshwater lakes have an input and an output. And what that does is all of the salts that had accumulated over land they get carried out by this outlet. But if you have no outlet to the ocean, you have a lake that eventually gets salty and then gets saltier and saltier over time. So things like the Salton Sea, the Great Salt Lake, all of these are endorheic lakes that have no outlet. But you have this kind of also economy that was based upon this lake, not just the agricultural aspect of it. And so what happens is Mulholland goes up into the Owens Valley and he finds this water supply. And what he does is he gets Los Angeles to very discreetly start buying land in the Owens Valley. So here is the Owens River and the Owens Valley. This is Owens Lake. But what he does is he gets people to start buying up land kind of on the sly, and that way they are acquiring water rights with that land. So again, very discreetly. And then this is coupled with a water shortage that's happening in the city of LA. So they put it to a ballot measure. They finally say like, okay, we have all these water rights up in the Owens River, in the Owens River Valley. And so we want the citizens of LA to pay to build an aqueduct that goes from the Owens River all the way down to LA. And because there was such a water shortage in LA, the voters vote overwhelmingly to fund the aqueduct. The Los Angeles Aqueduct is truly, it was an incredible undertaking. Through the mountains and deserts, it's over 200 miles long and was built, for the most part, without modern machinery that we would think of today. It was an engineering gravity-fed marvel, much more so than the Hetch Hetchy. They essentially moved a river, which is incredible. So they diverted this water off of the Owens River, just south of Owens Lake in the beginning, and moved a river from where it was going down to LA. So when they opened up the aqueduct, it was completed in 1913. Mulholland was a hero. He was a king of LA. It was finished under budget and ahead of schedule, which I feel like nobody ever says anything is finished under budget and ahead of schedule anymore. And it brought 4 times more water than LA could use. So all of a sudden, you have these really dramatic changes on contemporary LA because now they go from a water shortage and basically being a desert town to just having 4 times as much water as they could possibly need. And so I just want to point out, it's like here is LA is growing, railroad, and then after the aqueduct is complete and water comes in, the population of LA County, which is the blue here, really skyrocketed. And part of it, that was due to the availability of water. And so you get this golden age of Los Angeles where you start building developments and buildings and cities and huge lush gardens. Really kind of makes LA look like what it looks like today. It was desert in paradise. So I just want to go back for a second. Hollywood sign was originally the Hollywood land sign. It was a development, and they eventually took down the lands part and just left the iconic Hollywood sign up. At the same time, the adjacent San Fernando Valley, before the aqueduct, that land was useless. There was no water there, so there was really nothing there. And insiders and kind of, wealthy people in LA who were connected to Mulholland and knew what was going on, knew where the aqueduct was going to be. And so they cheaply bought up a bunch of land there and then sold it at exponential prices. They made an incredible amount of money. Oddly enough, Mulholland did not do this himself. He did not kind of try to get rich himself. He was really concerned about just with the city of LA and getting water to the city of LA. But through this process of moving this river, taking this resource, moving it geographically from Owens Valley all the way down to LA, many, many people got very, very wealthy off of it. And now if we go back to the Owens Valley, so it's not ideal when they take all the water off, but they did it kind of below, just south of Owens River. But 10 years later, LA is already running out of water again. And they want to extend the aqueduct farther north. And this leads to a huge conflict with ranchers and farmers, because now they are removing the input to Owens Lake. And the agricultural community, because they're removing so much water, pretty much gets decimated. This lush valley, now you can see the picture there, is dry. It dries up. There's no vegetation there. And because of this, there is constant attacks on the LA aqueduct. Farmers and ranchers who are very angry seize part of the aqueduct at one point. They bomb the aqueduct at one point. There are guards. People are prosecuted. It is incredibly contentious and still is. People who have lived in Owens Valley for a long time are still very mad about this. And Owens Lake, you're going to see a clip of the pollution at Owens Lake, and then you're going to watch a larger video about the importance of the ecology at Owens Lake. But, basically it is one of the largest sources of air pollution, has some of the worst air pollution for particulate matter in the United States. All of the things that were on the bottom of the lake, all of that very kind of silty soil just gets blown up into the air. And then Mulholland kind of has his downfall. The St. Francis Dam, which is where there's a reservoir for the water from Owens Lake, it has a small leak. Mulholland goes up and says, it's fine, don't worry about it. And then there was a breach of the dam and people die. And after that, he is devastated by this. He basically becomes kind of a recluse, and he is not really heard of after this. But he is really kind of, not single-handedly, but very responsible for that expansion of LA and bringing that water in that makes kind of LA this major city. Right, and so you can see here now we have a situation when we look at the water in Southern California, right? We have the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which is still running. We have the Colorado River Aqueduct, which is bringing in water off of the Colorado River. We have the California Aqueduct, which is coming up from the Central Valley. So really, we have transformed Southern California through the movement of water resources. And we are pretty unique in that manner, that this huge area with this huge population, San Diego included, can exist due to this engineering and moving of natural resources. So that is the end of this lecture. You're going to go on and watch a couple of short videos, and then you're going to complete your next exercise.